In this video, we are going to configure a local user in ISE, and then we're going to create an SSID and authenticate that SSID with ISE using that user account that we create. So to start, we need to create a user. So to do so, we typically would go under Administration and Identities. From here, we have network access users. We can click Add. Name, we're going to call him John. You can put in an email if needed. I recommend just putting in, just the user and then a password. And then user, let's just say John Doe. Then user group. Now, this is where we could specify a new group. So if you had like a user group outside of any of these, you could use employee. That's probably the easiest one. However, you can create different groups under the groups tab up here. So we're going to say he is an employee. He's an internal user, and we're going to submit. All right. Now the next step is going to be configuring an SSID and pointing it to ISE. So I've logged into my dashboard, and let me go to my SSIDs. So I've named it ISE Radius, and we're going to edit the settings of this SSID. Now, we're not going to use a pre-shared key. We're going to use WPA2 Enterprise with my Radius server. Now, correct settings for ISE are going to be WPA2 Enterprise with my Radius server, and then we're also going to select splash page of Cisco Identity Services Engine ISE authentication. This is going to allow for a URL redirect if for some reason we needed to change a device's status and redirect them to a page. So here we're going to configure the Radius server IP. 1812 is the authentication port. 1813 is the accounting port. They can also use 1645 and 1646. However, those are not standard. 1812 and 1813 are the Radius standard. We can also enable Radius testing. What that does is it actually sends a query to with Meraki underscore 802.1x underscore test as a user, just trying to look up that identity and make sure that it responds. If it doesn't respond, it'll fail over. But right now I'm not going to use that. We're also going to have accounting here where we have the Radius accounting server as the same server, the same shared secret. I'm going to make sure that I type this in correctly. And then one thing we want to do is the Radius attribute specifying group policy. So with a Radius response, we can also apply group policy based on who that user is. So we could say it's the airspace ACL name. We could also do filter ID. Airspace ACL name is easy because it can be ubiquitous from controller to Meraki wireless, both of which allowing us to apply a policy. And then from assign group policy by device type, we don't need to do that. We can enable walled garden. However, I'm going to have that disabled for this instance. And then bridge mode. We definitely want to bridge clients with the ISE policies, and then we're not going to set any VLANs. Just going to use the native VLAN. I'm going to click Save here. All right, so we have this SSID configured. We can click Test, and let's try and use. And then see what happens here. We only want one AP actually to fail. Or to pass, technically. Interesting. Either way, we did have some passes. It was responding, and that's all that matters at this point. So, all right. So this is all saved. The SSID is up and operational. The next step here is going to be configuring ISE. So we will come in here, and we're going to configure an ISE policy for authorization. So authentication, as I stated earlier, we have a .1x policy here. We also have the default rule if it doesn't match one of these, using all ID stores, and that should be sufficient for this. For authorization, however, we're going to go in and let's add a new rule below here. Let's also delete this rule because this is a very insecure policy to have. So we're going to say employee ISE Radius access. Now, once I've put the rule name in here, which by the way, these names are called out in the radius authorization logs, so it's always handy to make sure they're fairly specific. But we're going to say if, and this is where we use an internal identity group. We're going to choose employee. So if the user is an employee, and we're going to create a new condition. So there are so many different conditions we can add. What are the ones that are going to make this specific enough to be useful? So first one I will use is device type. We're going to say equals Meraki MR. Now, when we created our devices earlier in the previous video, we put them into different device groups. This will say that as long as it's a Meraki MR device, the next value we want to match can be a number of things. We could say if it's wireless.1x, however, it's probably going to be wireless.1x in this instance, especially with the next piece, which we're going to use radius. We're going to say called station ID, and here we're going to say ends with. What this is going to say is that all of our APs send a MAC address, SSID. So we're going to say this ends with ISE radius. And in theory, we could also add another attribute value if we wanted to lock down the type of authentication. Now, I recommend doing this in a production environment because not locking down the type of authentication means that you could have people trying to authenticate with less secure types of credentials. So we could say network access EAP authentication equals, and here we could say EAP-MS-CHAP version 2, add another attribute that is network access, and then EAP tunnel equals PEEP. So technically we could be done here. And what we're saying is if you're an employee and your device type is, and the device type this is coming from is an MR, the called station ID or the SSID is ends with ISE radius. The EAP authentication is EAP-MS-CHAP, and network access EAP tunnel is PEEP. Then we want to permit access. So let's select an item, standard, and we're going to permit access. This is just going to send an access accept response. Now that we have this rule configured, let's go ahead and click Save. Okay, so real quick recap again. If employee coming from an AP, from ISE radius, and using PEEP-MS-CHAP, then permit access. Okay, now I do have my tablet here, so let's go ahead and connect to this SSID. So let's do ISE radius, let's do John. Then let's do Dan. Let's see what we get here. All right, so now you can see that we have a certificate trust issue here because this certificate is not trusted inside of the iPad. Go ahead and click Trust. And as you can see, I am authenticating right now. So we look here. I should have a 10.10.1 address. I do, which is fantastic. So let's look at what it looks like from an ISE perspective. So if we go to Operations, Radius Live Logs, we should see, this is when we were testing. You see all these :02 MAC entries. Don't worry about those. But if you look here, what we can do is we can see we have an authentication passed and we have a session that has started. So if I move to live sessions, we should see that the session was started here from an Apple device. Now, if I click on this log, we're going to click the Authentication Detail Report. And slowly but surely, this will load. So, as you can see here, we hit the authentication policy of default .1x default. So we're saying we matched a .1x policy, and we hit the default network access. Authorization policy, you can see here we matched the employee ISE radius access, which is the one we created just a few minutes ago. We can also see that the authentication or authorization result was permit access. Now, if you wanted to make this more granular and you wanted to make the rule and all the conditions more granular, you could actually come in here and you could look through the authentication details and determine other things that you would like to interrogate on, such as the NAS port type being wireless IEEE 802.11. You could also, add in that location of HQ depending on where this is. You could also say service type is framed. All of these are valid things to add, more so the wireless IEEE 802.11 and framed. You could also add in the auth method as .1x. Really, that doesn't matter at this point. Other attributes, though, you could also call out here are, we could look at the types of destination port coming from the device. We could see the authentication identity store. We hit all AD join points. And then there's so much more information here, as well as the results. We can also see the actual process it went through. And this can be pretty lengthy, but it is handy to see all of the communication that actually happens between the client and the Radius server itself. One more thing to look at here is if we go home and we let this refresh, we can see that there are two endpoints it has seen. One of those endpoints is actually when we did the Radius test, the other one going to be the actual iPad. So if I click on endpoints, we can see one was considered a printer, because I guess Xerox probably owns the 000000. But we can also see the endpoint being a mobile device at 50%. And when clicking on that, we should have a list here in a second of endpoints, which only having one in the list. This is a lot of the reason I gave it a lot of resources, is so that these menus would pull up faster. Here we go. So as you can see here, here is our mobile device endpoint. If we click on that endpoint, we can see any of the attributes, such as, for instance, we can see all the most recent Radius authentication, the device it came from. We can see if it's been registered through a BYOD page or a guest registration page. We can also see all of the information we saw in that Radius authentication. It can be very handy when you're trying to hunt down what happened with a certain device. We can also look at authentication, so we can see the last authentication succeeded process, as well as any connect info here. Aside from this, we can also look at threats. So there's actually integration with SourceFire and AMP for endpoints, which can allow for ISE to, if running the client, the AMP endpoints client, ISE can interrogate the device and find out its endpoint status. And the AMP can actually send down and change that device's authorization. We can also see any vulnerabilities. Obviously, none of those are going to be populated here. So, so in this video, what we've done is configured an SSID for Radius authentication. We have configured the policy in ISE and a local user to authenticate with. And we were able to successfully authenticate and review the authentication process. So I hope this was informative for you, and I appreciate you watching. Thank you.